However important Maria thought love was, she did not forget the advice she was given on her first night, and did her best to confine love to the pages of her diary. Apart from that, she tried desperately to be the best, to earn a lot of money in as short time as possible, to think very little, and to find a good reason for doing what she was doing. That was the most difficult part. What was the real reason? She was doing it because she needed to. This wasn't quite true. Everyone needs to earn money, but not everyone chooses to live on the margins of society. She was doing it because she wanted to experience something new. No, that wasn't true either. The world was full of new experiences like skiing or going sailing on Lake Geneva, for example, but she had never been interested. She was doing it because she had nothing to lose, because her life was one of constant, day to day frustration. No, none of these answers was true. So it was best to forget all about it and simply deal with whatever lay along her path. She had a lot in common with the other prostitutes and with all the other women she had known in her life, whose greatest dream was to get married and have a secure life. Those who didn't think like this either had a husband. Almost a third of her colleagues were married or were recently divorced. Because of that, and in order to understand herself, she tried as tactfully as possible to understand why her colleagues had chosen this profession. She heard nothing new, but she made a list of their responses. They said they had to help out their husband. Wasn't he jealous? What if one of her husband's friends came to the club one night? But Maria didn't dare to ask these questions. That they wanted to buy a house for their mother, her own excuse, apparently so noble and the most common one, to earn enough money for their fair home. Colombians, Thais, Peruvians, Brazilians all loved this reason, even though they had earned enough money several times over and had immediately spent it, afraid to realize their dream, to have fun. This didn't really tally with the atmosphere in the club and always rang false, and they could not find any other kind of work. This wasn't a good reason either. Switzerland was full of jobs for cleaners, drivers, and cooks. None of them came up with any valid reason, and so she stopped trying to explain her particular universe. She saw that the owner, Milan, was quite right. No one ever again offered her 1,000 francs for the privilege of spending a few hours with her. On the other hand, no one ever explained when she asked for 350 francs, as if they already knew or only asked in order to humiliate her or wanted to avoid any unpleasant surprises. One of the girls said, "Prostitution isn't like other businesses. Beginners earn more, and the more experienced earn less. Always pretend you're a beginner." Maria still didn't know who the special clients were. They had only been mentioned on the first night, and no one ever spoke of them. Gradually, she picked up the most important tricks of the trade, like never asking personal questions, smiling a lot, and talking as little as possible, never arranging to meet anyone outside the club. The most important pieces of advices, however, came from a Filipino woman called Naya. When your client comes, you must always groan as if you were having an orgasm too. That guarantees customer loyalty. But why? They are just paying for their own satisfaction. No, that's where you're wrong. A man doesn't prove he's a man by getting an erection. He's only a real man if he can pleasure a woman. And if he can pleasure a prostitute, he'll think he's the best lover on the block. And so 6 months passed. Maria learned all the necessary lessons, for example, how the Copacabana worked. Since it was one of the most expensive places in Rue de Berne, the clientele was largely made up of executives who had permission to get home late because they were out having supper with clients. But these suppers could never last longer than 11 o'clock at night. Most of the prostitutes who worked there were aged between 18 and 22, and they stayed on average for 2 years when they would be able to replace by newer recruits. They then moved to the Neon, then to the Xenium, and the price went down as the women's age went up, and the hours of work grew fewer and fewer. They almost all ended up in the tropical ecstasy who accepted women over 30. But once they were there, they could only just earn enough to pay for their lunch and their rent by going with 1 or 2 students a day. The average fee per client was just about enough to buy a bottle of cheap wine. She went to bed with many men. She didn't care how old they were or how they were dressed, but whether she said yes or no depended on how they smelled. She had nothing against cigarettes, but she hated cheap aftershave or those who didn't wash or whose clothes stank of booze. The Copacabana was a quiet place, and Switzerland was possibly the best country in the world in which to work as a prostitute. As long as you had a residence permit and a work permit, kept all your prayers in order, and paid your social security. Milan was always saying that he didn't want his children to see his name in the tabloid newspapers, and so he was as strict as a policeman when it came to keeping an eye on his employees. Once you had got past the barrier of the first or second night, it was a profession much like any other, in which you worked hard, fought off the competition, tried to maintain standards, put in the necessary hours, got a bit stressed out, complained about your workload, and rested on Sundays. Most of the prostitutes had some kind of religious faith and attended their respective churches and masses, said their prayers, and had their encounters with God. Maria, however, was struggling in the pages of her diary not to lose her soul. She discovered to her surprise that 1 in every 5 clients didn't want her in order to have sex, but simply to talk a little. They paid for the bar tab and the hotel room, and when the moment came for them both to take off their clothes, the man would say, "No, that won't be necessary." They wanted to talk about the pressures of work, about their unfaithful wife, about how lonely they felt, how they had no one to talk to, something she knew about all too well. At first, she found this very odd. Then one night, she went to the hotel with an arrogant Frenchman, a headhunter for top executive jobs. He told her this as if he were telling her the most fascinating thing in the world. And this is what he said. "Do you know who the loneliest person in the world is? The executive with a successful career, earning an enormous salary, trusted by those above and below him, with a family to go on holiday with, and children who he helps out with their homework, but who is then approached by someone like me and asks the following question: how would you like to change your job and earn twice as much? The executive, who has every reason to feel wanted and happy, becomes the most miserable creature on the planet. Why? Because he has no one to talk to. He is tempted to accept my offer, but he can't talk about it to his work colleagues because they would do everything they could to persuade him to stay. He can't talk about it to his wife, who has been his companion in his rise up the ladder of success and understands a great deal about security, but nothing about taking risks. He can't talk to anyone about it, and there he is, confronted by the biggest decision of his life. Can you imagine how that man feels? No, that man wasn't the loneliest person in the world. Maria knew the loneliest person on the face of this earth, herself. Nevertheless, she agreed with her client, hoping to get a big tip, which she did. But his words made her realize that she needed to find some way of freeing her clients from the enormous pressure they all seemed to be under. This meant both improving the quality of her services and the chance of earning some extra money. When she realized that releasing tension in the soul could be as lucrative as releasing tension in the body, if not more lucrative, she started going to the library again. She began asking for books about marital problems, psychology, and politics. The librarian was delighted to see that the young woman of whom she had grown so fond had stopped thinking about sex and was now concentrating on more important matters. Maria became a regular reader of newspapers, especially where possible the financial pages, because the majority of her clients were business executives. She sought out self-help books because her clients nearly all asked for her advice. She read studies of the human emotions because all her clients were in some kind of emotional pain. Maria was a respectable, rather unusual prostitute, and after 6 months she had acquired a large, faithful, very selective clientele, thus arousing the envy and jealousy, but also the admiration of her colleagues. As for sex, it had as yet added nothing to her life. It was just a matter of opening her legs, asking them to use a condom, moaning a bit in the hope of getting a better tip. Thanks to the Filipino woman Naya, she had learned that moaning could earn her another 50 francs. And taking a shower afterwards, hoping that the water would wash her soul clean. Nothing out of the ordinary, and no kissing. For a prostitute, the kiss was sacred. Naya had taught her to keep her kisses for the love of her life, just like in the story of Sleeping Beauty, a kiss that would waken her from her slumbers and return her to the world of fairy tales, in which Switzerland was once more the country of chocolate, cows, and clocks. And no orgasms either, no pleasure or excitement. In her search to be the very best, Maria had watched a few porn movies, hoping to pick up tips for her work. She had seen a lot of interesting things, but had preferred not to try any of them out on her clients because they took too long, and Milan was happiest when the women arranged 3 men a night. By the end of the 6 months, Maria had 60,000 Swiss francs in a bank account. She ate in better restaurants, had bought a TV. She never watched it, but she liked to have it there, and was now seriously considering moving to a better apartment. Although she could easily afford to buy books, she continued going to the library, which was her bridge to the real world, a more solid and enduring world. She enjoyed chatting to the librarian, who was happy because Maria had perhaps found a boyfriend and a job, although she never asked. The Swiss being naturally shy and discreet, a complete fallacy, because in the Copacabana and in bed they were as uninhibited, joyful, or neurotic as any other nationality. From Maria's diary, one warm Sunday evening. All men, tall or short, arrogant or unassuming, friendly or cold, have one characteristic in common. When they come to the club, they are afraid. The more experienced amongst them hide their fear by talking loudly. The more inhibited cannot hide their feelings and start drinking to see if they can drive the fear away. But I am convinced that, with a few very rare exceptions, the special clients to whom Milan has not yet introduced me, they are all afraid. Afraid of what? I am the one who should be shaking. I am the one who leaves the club and goes off to a strange hotel, and I am not the one with the superior physical strength or the weapons. Men are very strange, and I don't just mean the ones who come to the Copacabana, but all the men I've ever met. They can beat you up, shout at you, threaten you, and yet they are scared to death of women. Really? Perhaps not the women they married, but there's always one woman who frightens them and forces them to submit to her caprices, even if it's their own mother. The men she had met since she arrived in Geneva always did everything they could to appear confident, as if they were in perfect control of the world and of their own lives. Maria, however, could see in their eyes that they were afraid of their wife, the feeling of panic that they might not be able to get an erection, that they might not seem manly enough even to do the ordinary prostitute whom they were paying for her service. If they went to a shop and didn't like the shoes they had bought, they would be quite prepared to go back, receipt in hand, and demand a refund. And yet, even though they were paying for some female company, if they didn't manage to get an erection, they would be too ashamed ever to go back to the same club again, because they would assume that all the other women there would know. I am the one who should feel ashamed for being unable to arouse them. But no, they always blame themselves. To avoid such embarrassments, Maria always tried to put men at their ease, and if someone seemed drunker or more fragile than usual, she would avoid full sex and concentrated instead on caresses and masturbation, which always seemed to please them immensely. Absurd though this might seem, since they could perfectly well masturbate on their own. She had to make sure that they didn't feel ashamed. These men, so powerful and arrogant at work, constantly having to deal with employees, customers, suppliers, secrets, posturings, hypocrisy, fear, and oppression, ended their day in a nightclub and they didn't mind spending 350 Swiss francs to stop being themselves for a night. For a night? Now come on, Maria, you're exaggerating. It's really only 45 minutes. And if you allow time for taking off clothes, making some phony gestures of affection, having a bit of banal conversation, and getting dressed again, the amount of time spent actually having sex is about 11 minutes. 11 minutes. The world revolved around something that only took 11 minutes. And because of those 11 minutes in any one 24-hour day, assuming that they all made love to their wives every day, which is patently absurd and a complete lie, they got married, supported a family, put up with the screaming kids, thought up ridiculous excuses to justify getting home late, augured dozens, if not hundreds of other women with whom they would like to go for a walk around Lake Geneva, bought expensive clothes for themselves and even more expensive clothes for their wives, paid prostitutes to try to give them what they were missing, and thus sustained a vast industry of cosmetics, diet food, exercise, pornography, and power. And yet, when they got together with other men, contrary to popular belief, they never talked about women. They talked about jobs, money, and sport. Something was very wrong with civilization. And it wasn't the destruction of the Amazon rainforest or the ozone layer, the death of the panda, cigarettes, carcinogenic foodstuffs, or prison conditions, as the newspapers would have it. It was precisely the thing she was working with: sex. But Maria wasn't there to save humanity, but to increase her bank balance, survive another 6 months of solitude and another 6 months of the choice she had made, send a regular monthly sum of money to her mother, who was thrilled to learn that the earlier absence of money had been due to the Swiss post, so much less efficient than the Brazilian postal system, and to buy all the things she had always dreamed of and never had. She moved to a much better apartment with central heating, although the summer had already arrived, and from her window she could see a church, a Japanese restaurant, a supermarket, and a very nice cafe where she used to sit and read the newspapers. Otherwise, just as she had promised herself, it was a question of putting up with the same old routine: go to the Copacabana, have a drink and a dance, what do you think of Brazil, then back to his hotel, get the money up front, have a little conversation, and know precisely which points to touch, both body and soul, but mainly the soul. Give some advice on personal problems, be his friend for half an hour, of which 11 minutes would be spent in opening her legs, closing her legs, and pretending to moan with pleasure. Thanks very much. See you next week. You're very manly, you know. Tell me how things were next time we meet. Oh, that's very generous of you. But really, there's no need. It's been a pleasure to spend my time with you. And above all, never fall in love. That was the most important and most sensible piece of advice that the other Brazilian woman had given her before she had disappeared, perhaps because she herself had fallen in love. Because, incredible though it may seem, in just 2 months of working there, Maria had had several proposals of marriage, of which at least 3 were serious. The director of a firm of accountants, the pilot she went with on the very first night, and the owner of a shop specializing in knives. All three had promised to take her away from that life and to give her a nice house, a future, perhaps children and grandchildren. And all for 11 minutes a day? It wasn't possible. After her experiences at the Copacabana, she knew that she wasn't the only person who felt lonely. Human beings can withstand a week without water, 2 weeks without food, many years of homelessness, but not loneliness. It is the worst of all tortures, the worst of all sufferings. Like her, these men and the many others who sought her company were all tormented by that same destructive feeling, the sense that no one else on the planet cared about them. In order to avoid being tempted by love, she kept her heart for her diary. She entered the Copacabana with only her body and her brain, which was growing sharper and more perceptive all the time. She had managed to persuade herself that there was some important reason why she had come to Geneva and ended up in Rue de Berne. And every time she borrowed a book from the library, she was confirmed in her view that no one wrote properly about the 11 most important minutes of the day. Perhaps that was her destiny. However hard it might seem at the moment to write a book relating to her story, her adventure. That was it, her adventure. Although it was a forbidden word that no one dared to speak, and which was most people preferred to watch on the television in films that were shown over and over at all the times of the day and night. That was what she was looking for. It was a word that evoked deserts, journeys to unknown places, idle conversations with mysterious men on a boat in the middle of a river, plane journeys, cinema studios, tribes of Indians, glaciers, and Africa. She liked the idea of a book and had even thought of a title, 11 Minutes. She began to put lines into 3 categories: The Exterminators, an homage to a film she had enjoyed hugely, who arrived stinking of drink, pretending not to look at anyone but convinced that everyone was looking at them, dancing only briefly and then getting straight down to the business of going back to their hotel. The Pretty Women type, again named after a film, who tried to appear elegant, gentlemanly, affectionate, as if the world depended on such kindness in order to continue turning on its axis, as if they had just been walking down the street and had come into the club by chance. They were always very sweet at first, and rather uncertain when they got to the hotel, but because of that, they always proved even more demanding than the exterminators. And lastly, there was the Godfather type, named after yet another film, who treated a woman's body as if it were a piece of merchandise. They were the most genuine. They danced, talked, never gave tips, knew what they were buying and how much it was worth, and never let themselves be taken in by anything the women of their choice might say. They were the ones who, in a very subtle way, knew the meaning of the word adventure. From Maria's diary on a day when she had her period and couldn't work. If I were to tell someone about my life today, I could do it in a way that would make them think me a brave, happy, independent woman. Rubbish. I'm not even allowed to mention the only word that is more important than the 11 minutes. Love. All my life, I thought of love as some kind of voluntary enslavement. Well, that's a lie. Freedom only exists when love is present. The person who gives him or herself wholly, the person who feels freest, is the person who loves the most wholeheartedly. And the person who loves wholeheartedly feels free. That was why, regardless of what I might experience, do, or learn, nothing makes sense. I hope this time passes quickly so that I can resume my search for myself in the form of a man who understands me and does not make me suffer. But what am I saying? In love, no one can harm anyone else. We are each of us responsible for our own feelings and cannot blame someone else for what we feel. It hurts when I lost each of the various men I fell in love with. Now, though, I'm convinced that no one loses anyone because no one owns anyone. That is the true experience of freedom. Having the most important thing in the world without owning it. Another 3 months passed and autumn came, as did the date marked on the calendar. 90 days until her return journey home. Everything had happened so quickly and so slowly, she thought, realizing that time exists in two different dimensions, dependent on one's state of mind, but in both sorts of time her adventure was drawing to a close. She could, of course, continue, but she could not forget the sad smile of the invisible woman who had accompanied her on that walk around the lake, telling her that things weren't that simple. However tempted she was to continue, however prepared she was for the challenges she had met on her path, all these months living alone with herself had taught her that there is always a right moment to stop something. In 90 days' time she would return to the interior of Brazil, where she would buy a small farm. She had earned rather more than she had expected, a few cows, Brazilian, not Swiss, invite her mother and father to come and live with her, take on a couple of workers, and set the business in motion. Although she believed that love is the only true experience of freedom and that no one can possess anyone else, she still harbored a secret desire for revenge, and this formed part of her triumphal return to Brazil. After setting up the farm, she would go back to her hometown and make a large deposit in Swiss francs at the bank where the boy who had two-timed her with her best friend was working. "Hi, who are you? Don't you remember me?" he would say. She would pretend to be trying hard to remember and would end up saying that no, she didn't. She had just come back from a year in Europe. She would say this very slowly so that all his colleagues could hear. Or rather, Switzerland. That would sound more exotic and adventurous than France, where they have the best banks in the world. Who was he? He would mention their school days. She would say, "Ah, yes, I think I remember." But from her face it would be clear that she didn't. Vengeance would be hers, and then it would just be a matter of working hard. And when the farm was doing as well as she expected, she would be able to devote herself to the thing that mattered most in her life, finding true love. The man who had been waiting for her all these years, but whom she had not yet had the chance to meet. Maria decided to forget all about writing the book entitled 11 Minutes. Now She needed to concentrate on the farm, on her future plans, otherwise, she would end up postponing her trip, a fatal risk. That afternoon, she went off to meet her best and only friend, the librarian. She asked for a book on cattle raising and farm administration. The librarian said, "You know, a few months ago, when you came here looking for books about sex, I began to fear for you. So many pretty young girls let themselves be seduced by the illusion of easy money, forgetting that one day they'll be old and will have missed out on meeting the love of their life." "Do you mean prostitution?" "That's a very strong word. As I said, I'm working for a company that imports and exports meat. But if I had to become a prostitute, would the consequences be so very grave if I stopped at the right moment? After all, being young inevitably means making mistakes. That's what all the drug addicts say, that you just have to know when to stop. But none of them do. You must have been pretty when you were younger, and you were brought up in a country that respects its inhabitants. Was that enough for you to be happy?" "I'm proud of how I dealt with any obstacles in my life." Should she go on? Thought the librarian. Yes, why not? The girl needed to learn a bit about life. "I had a happy childhood. I studied at one of the best schools in Bern. Then I came to work in Geneva, where I met and married the man I loved. I did everything for him and he did everything for me. Time passed and he retired. When he was free to do exactly what he wanted with his time, his eyes grew sadder, because he had probably never really thought about himself all his life. We never had any serious arguments or any great excitements. He was never unfaithful to me and was never rude to me in public. We lived a very ordinary life, so much so that, without a job to do, he felt useless, unimportant, and a year later he died of cancer." She was telling the truth, but felt that she might be having a negative influence on the girl standing before her. "I still think it's best to lead a life without surprises," she concluded. "If we hadn't, my husband might have died even earlier. Who knows?" Maria left, determined to learn all about farming. Since she had the afternoon free, she decided to go for a stroll, and in the upper part of the city came across a small yellow plaque bearing a drawing of a sun and an inscription, "Road to Santiago." What did it mean? There was a bar on the other side of the road, and since she had now learned to ask about anything she didn't understand, she resolved to go in and ask. "I've no idea," said the girl serving behind the bar. It was a very expensive place, and the coffee cost 3 times the normal price. Since she had money, though, and now that she was there, she ordered a coffee and decided to spend the next hour or so learning all there was to know about farm administration. She opened the book eagerly, but found it impossible to concentrate. It was so boring. It would be much more interesting to talk to one of her clients about it. They always knew how best to handle money. She paid for her coffee, got up, thanked the girl who had served her, left a large tip. She had invented a superstitious belief according to which the more you gave, the more you got back. went over to the door and, without realizing the importance of that moment, heard the words that would change forever her plans, her future, her farm, her idea of happiness, her female soul, her male approach to life, her place in the world. Hang on a moment. Surprised, she glanced to one side. This was a respectable bar. It wasn't the Copacabana, where men had the right to say that, although the women could always respond, "No, I'm leaving. You can't stop me." She was about to ignore the remark, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she turned towards the voice. She saw a very strange scene. Kneeling on the floor, with various paintbrushes scattered around him, was a long-haired young man of about 30, or should she have said a boy of about 30? Her world had aged very fast. He was making a drawing of a gentleman sitting in a chair with a glass of anisette beside him. She hadn't noticed them when she came in. "Don't go. I've nearly finished this portrait, and I'd like to paint you as well," Maria replied, and as she did so, she created the link that was lacking in the universe. "No, I'm not interested." "You've got a special light about you. Let me at least do a sketch." What was a sketch? What did he mean by a special light? Besides, she was vain enough to want to have her portrait painted by someone who appeared to be a serious artist. Her imagination took flight. What if he really was famous? She would be immortalized forever in a painting that would be exhibited in Paris or in Salvador de Bahia. She would become a legend. On the other hand, what was the man doing, surrounded by all that clatter? In an expensive, perhaps usually crowded cafe. Guessing her thoughts, the waitress said softly, "He's a very well-known artist." Her intuition had been right. Maria tried not to show her feelings and to remain calm. "He comes here now and again, and he always brings an important client with him. He says he likes the atmosphere here, that it inspires him. He's doing a painting of people who represents the city. It was commissioned by the town of Hall." Maria looked at the subject of the portrait. Again the waitress read her thoughts. "He's a chemist who apparently made some really revolutionary discovery. He won the Nobel Prize." "Don't go," said the painter again. "I'll be finished in 5 minutes. Order what you like and put it on my bill." As if hypnotized, she sat down at the bar, ordered an anisette. She wasn't used to drinking, and the only thing that occurred to her was to order the same as the Nobel Prize winner, and watch the man working. "I don't represent the city, so he must be interested in something else. But he's not really my type," she thought automatically, repeating what she always said to herself ever since she had been working at the Copacabana. It was her salvation, her voluntary denial of the trap set by the heart. Having cleared that up, she didn't mind waiting a while. Perhaps the waitress was right. Perhaps this man could open doors to a world of which she knew nothing. She watched how quickly and adroitly he put the finishing touches to his work.